April 1945, the Ruhr Valley. The industrial heart of Germany is an endless maze of steel mills, concrete factories, and dense urban sprawl. Inside this iron labyrinth, Field Marshal Walther Model is trapped with over 300,000 battle-hardened soldiers. By every conventional rule of war, this terrain heavily favors the defender. Allied commanders braced for a nightmare, a grueling, month-long bloodbath, a Western Stalingrad fought block by block. Yet, just weeks later, this massive army group would completely disintegrate, yielding to American forces with shockingly light casualties. How did a seemingly impenetrable fortress, defended by a desperate veteran army, collapse so quickly? The answer does not lie in a massive frontal assault, nor in the sheer tonnage of artillery shells dropped on the industrial ruins. Instead, the collapse of Army Group B was the result of a meticulously engineered strangulation. When the American First and Ninth Armies locked their steel pincers around the Ruhr, they recognized that fighting block by block through a sprawling urban fortress would cost tens of thousands of Allied lives. So, they changed the equation. They shifted their focus from kinetic destruction to the systematic dismantling of enemy logistics and morale. They built a psychological pressure cooker. By severing supply lines, the Americans choked off fuel, food, and ammunition, leaving German units paralyzed. But more importantly, the Allies weaponized the concept of isolation. Through a relentless barrage of leaflets, frontline loudspeaker broadcasts, and deliberate, agonizing pauses in the ground offensive, they allowed the hopelessness of the situation to sink in. They did not just sit idle. They actively demonstrated that there was no relief force coming and no escape. Every passing hour of isolation eroded the defenders' resolve. The story of the Ruhr Pocket is a stark study in psychological warfare and strategic patience. It asks a profound question about the nature of combat. How do you break the fighting spirit of over 250,000 veteran soldiers, forcing an entire army group to surrender before the final, apocalyptic assault even begins? To understand how this unprecedented collapse was engineered and how the will of a formidable military machine was shattered, we first have to look at the impossible trap they were ordered to hold. In late March 1945, the natural barrier of the Rhine River, Germany's historic western shield, had finally been shattered. American forces had seized a critical bridgehead at Remagen, while massive amphibious and airborne operations secured further footholds to the north. But immediately beyond the eastern banks of the Rhine lay an obstacle far more intimidating than the river itself. This was the Ruhrgebiet. It was the industrial beating heart of the Third Reich, a sprawling, densely packed megalopolis covering over 4,000 square miles. It was not a single city, but an endless, interconnected web of coal mines, steel mills, rail yards, and tightly knit factory towns spanning urban centers like Essen, Dortmund, and Duisburg. For an advancing mechanized army, it was a tactical nightmare. Every towering smokestack was a potential artillery observation post. Every reinforced concrete factory floor was a ready-made bunker. Every slag heap and elevated rail embankment offered perfect defilade for hidden anti-tank guns. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower and his field commanders understood exactly what pushing straight into that industrial jungle would mean. It would require dragging infantry divisions into a brutal, vertical war of attrition. Casualties would not be measured in the hundreds, but in the tens of thousands. To avoid feeding their advancing armies into a concrete meat grinder, the Allied High Command executed a massive double envelopment. Rather than driving directly into the Ruhr, they would drive completely around it. Lieutenant General William Simpson's Ninth Army swung wide to the north, breaking out of their Rhine bridgeheads and pushing rapidly eastward into the German plains. Simultaneously, Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges' First Army broke out from the Remagen bridgehead, hooking sharply to the south and east. The strategy was ambitious but clear: create a massive ring, bypass the dense urban sprawl entirely, and isolate the industrial region from the rest of Germany. In Berlin, deep underground in the Führer bunker, Adolf Hitler reacted to the Allied envelopment maneuver, not with a tactical withdrawal, but with absolute ideological rigidity. He explicitly designated the entire region as Festung Ruhr, Fortress Ruhr. The orders transmitted to the trapped commanders were unequivocal. There would be no retreat, no surrender, and no breakout attempt. Army Group B was ordered to stand its ground, tie down as many Allied divisions as possible, and fight to the last man. Hitler envisioned a fanatical, protracted defense that would bleed the Americans white in the rubble of the steel mills, buying crucial time to stabilize the collapsing fronts of the Reich. Furthermore, to ensure the Allies captured nothing of economic value, he expected the strict implementation of the Nero Decree, the total, scorched earth destruction of the Ruhr's industrial infrastructure by the defenders themselves. But the grand, uncompromising directives issued from a map table in Berlin bore almost no resemblance to the grim reality unfolding on the ground. Field Marshal Walter Model, widely known as the Führer's fireman for his uncanny ability to salvage catastrophic defensive situations, found himself presiding over a hollowed-out force. He commanded the remnants of the 5th Panzer Army, the 15th Army, and elements of the 1st Parachute Army. On paper, it was a formidable order of battle, representing hundreds of thousands of combat veterans. In practice, the logistical arteries required to sustain these units had been completely severed. For months, relentless Allied strategic bombing campaigns had systematically pulverized the German rail network, preventing any meaningful flow of supplies. Now, completely cut off from the east by the advancing American pincers, the logistical crisis became terminal. Fuel was practically non-existent. Without diesel and gasoline, armored divisions lost their primary advantage, mobility. Tank commanders were forced to tow their Panther and Panzer IV tanks into static defensive positions using draft horses, or they simply abandoned their armor along the roadsides when their fuel gauges finally hit empty. Ammunition was critically low across all sectors. Artillery batteries, normally the backbone of German defensive doctrine, were strictly rationing their shells, often restricted to firing only 1 or 2 rounds a day. Food supplies for the troops, as well as for the millions of civilians trapped inside the industrial basin, were dwindling rapidly. Quartermasters were forced to raid local civilian bakeries and empty agricultural storehouses just to keep their men fed on basic survival rations. The vaunted Fortress Ruhr was not an impenetrable stronghold. It was a sprawling, open-air prison, stripped of the fundamental resources required to wage modern war. Despite the severe logistical failures paralyzing the German defenders, the American forces surrounding the Ruhr faced a profound operational dilemma of their own. Leaving a hostile army group of over 300,000 men operating aggressively in their rear was a massive strategic risk that could jeopardize the entire Allied advance into central Germany. Yet, launching an immediate, all-out assault into the densely packed cities remained a horrific prospect. Every instinct of American tactical doctrine emphasized overwhelming firepower and rapid mobility, but the urban terrain of the Ruhr sharply negated both. Armored columns would be restricted to narrow, rubble-choked streets where they would be boxed in, becoming easy prey for infantry armed with Panzerfausts, hiding in basement windows and ruined rooftops. The prospect of clearing out the Ruhr factory by factory threatened to stall the momentum of the spring offensive entirely. On the other hand, a purely passive siege carried its own severe dangers. If the American army simply sat on the perimeter and waited for starvation to take its toll, they risked surrendering the operational initiative to a commander who specialized in turning the tables. Field Marshal Model was a deeply pragmatic and dangerous tactician. The American command feared that given enough time and breathing room, he might reorganize his chaotic defensive lines, pool whatever precious drops of fuel remained into a specialized armored spearhead, and launch a concentrated, desperate breakout attempt toward the Harz Mountains to the east. A successful breakout would not only prolong the war, but inflict heavy casualties, severe supply line disruptions, and embarrass the Allied High Command. The Americans could not afford to just sit and wait, nor could they afford to blindly charge into the concrete labyrinth. They had to act decisively to turn the loose encirclement into an inescapable death grip. Before they could begin systematically dismantling the will of the trapped German army, they had to make absolutely certain that the trap was physically sealed. They needed to officially lock the door before Model could figure out a way to break it down. The decisive moment came on April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday. Near the small town of Lippstadt, the leading elements of the American 3rd Armored Division, driving hard from the south, finally spotted the olive-drab silhouettes of the 2nd Armored Division, pushing down from the north. When those two spearheads physically linked up, the Ruhr Pocket ceased to be an operational concept and became a terrifying geographical reality. A solid ring of American armor and infantry now spanned nearly 200 miles around the entire industrial basin. The door was officially locked. Over 300,000 German soldiers were entirely cut off from the retreating Wehrmacht, trapped inside the largest double envelopment of the Western Front. Inside the pocket, Field Marshal Model immediately recognized the gravity of the encirclement. According to standard German tactical doctrine, this was the exact moment to launch a ferocious, concentrated counterattack, a localized spearhead designed to shatter the weakest point of the American line before the ring could fully harden. Model had the manpower, and he technically possessed some of the most elite mechanized units remaining in the German arsenal, including the remnants of the famed Panzerlehr and the 116th Panzer Division. Their crews were highly decorated veterans. Their heavy Panther and Tiger tanks were technologically superior in a head-to-head firefight against most Allied armor. But as Model's staff evaluated the logistics required to punch through the American line, the entire mechanism of maneuver warfare collapsed against an undeniable, physical, absolute, empty fuel tanks. An armored division cannot operate on fanaticism or desperate orders from Berlin. It requires thousands of gallons of gasoline simply to move its tanks from a concealed staging area to a line of departure. The reality on the ground was stark. Elite tank commanders, men who had spent years mastering the fluid, aggressive tactics of blitzkrieg, were reduced to staring helplessly at their fuel gauges. The physics of an internal combustion engine did not care about iron crosses, ideological fervor, or tactical brilliance. Without diesel, a 45-ton Panther tank was no longer an instrument of mobile terror. It was a static, highly vulnerable steel pillbox. Frantic attempts to siphon fuel from abandoned supply trucks or disabled civilian vehicles barely yielded enough to idle the engines, let alone sustain a multi-day armored thrust through fortified hostile lines. On the outside of the ring, American commanders were nervously bracing for the inevitable breakout attempt. Artillery batteries were pre-sighted, and anti-tank battalions frantically dug in, expecting a massive, desperate wave of German armor to come screaming out of the industrial fog. Days ticked by. The massive, coordinated counterattack never materialized. Instead of a roaring armored fist trying to smash the encirclement, the Americans were met only with sporadic, localized infantry skirmishes and localized artillery fire. The formidable German panzer divisions were paralyzed, bolted to the earth by their own dry fuel lines. It was a staggering realization for the Allied command. The vaunted German war machine had not just been outmaneuvered, it had been fundamentally grounded. With the physical escape route permanently closed and the enemy's offensive capability completely neutralized by logistics, the Americans realized they did not need to destroy the remaining tanks. They began an entirely different kind of assault, one aimed not at the thick steel armor of the Ruhr, but at the minds of the men sitting hopelessly inside it. The American 1st and Ninth Armies did not remain idle behind their newly formed perimeter. General Dwight D. Eisenhower and his field commanders, Courtney Hodges and William Simpson, initiated a methodical, terrifyingly clinical campaign of segmentation. They recognized that while the Ruhr Pocket was surrounded on a macro level, it still possessed internal cohesion. As long as Army Group B could shift its dwindling reserves from one threatened sector to another, it remained a dangerous, unified organism. The American strategy was to vivisect this organism. Rather than launching a massive, head-on assault into the densest urban centers like Essen or Dortmund, where the concrete rubble heavily favored the defender, the Allies probed for the geographical seams. They directed their armored thrusts into the softer, more rural underbelly of the pocket, the rugged, heavily forested hills of the Sauerland to the south, and the narrow river valleys that crisscross the industrial basin. They specifically targeted the fundamental arteries of industrial warfare. American mechanized cavalry and infantry divisions advanced with surgical precision to capture the critical dams and reservoirs of the region, including the massive Mona and Sorpa dam complexes. This was not an attempt to flood the defenders out. It was a calculated campaign of resource strangulation. The massive steel mills and the steam-powered rail networks of the Ruhr required billions of gallons of fresh water to operate. By seizing the reservoirs, the Americans effectively pulled the plug on the region's remaining industrial life support. Without water, the few remaining steam locomotives could not build pressure. The trains, hidden in deep tunnels to escape endless airstrikes, became useless steel carcasses. Simultaneously, American forces captured key rail marshalling yards and road junctions like Ham, Hagen, and Paderborn. By driving these deep, armored wedges into the pocket, the Allies shattered the internal lines of communication. They sliced the massive encirclement into 2, then 4, then dozens of isolated, uncoordinated fragments. A German battalion taking fire in the north could no longer call for reinforcements from the south, because the roads connecting them were now occupied by American Sherman tanks. The pocket was physically shrinking, squeezing the defenders into an ever-tightening vice of starvation and tactical paralysis. Inside this collapsing cage, Field Marshal Walther Model understood exactly what the American segmentation meant. His army group was being dismantled, piece by piece, cut off from reality, operating from a constantly shifting series of makeshift command posts hidden in thick forests or deep within underground coal mine shafts. Model reacted to the tactical strangulation with uncompromising brutality. The man who had repeatedly saved the Eastern Front from total collapse by executing brilliant, flexible defensive maneuvers was now trapped in a static prison, stripped of his ability to maneuver. Forced to rely entirely on holding the line through sheer willpower, he turned to terror to maintain the structural integrity of his disintegrating force. Model issued a series of draconian orders of the day, demanding fanatical resistance in the name of a promised, albeit mathematically impossible, final victory. He strictly forbade any unauthorized withdrawal, explicitly stating that any commander yielding a single yard of ground would be treated as a traitor. To enforce this iron discipline, Model unleashed the terror apparatus of the military state. He gave sweeping, absolute authority to the military police, universally feared by frontline troops and mockingly referred to as chained dogs, due to the heavy, crescent-shaped metal gorgets they wore around their necks. These mobile execution squads, operating alongside fanatical SS detachments, roamed the chaotic rear areas behind the crumbling front lines. They established lethal checkpoints at vital crossroads, bridges, and rail crossings. Any soldier, regardless of rank, found moving away from the front without written movement orders was immediately pulled out of the line. The concept of defeatism was broadened to include any complaint about rations, any doubt about the outcome of the war, or the mere suggestion of surrender. Soon, a horrifying, macabre scenery began to define the shattered streets of the Ruhr. The bodies of German soldiers were left swinging from the lampposts of Wuppertal, the twisted steel girders of ruined bridges in Duisburg, and the ancient oak branches of the Sauerland forests. Pinned to the chests of these executed men were crude cardboard placards bearing stark warnings. "I am a coward. I betrayed my comrades," or "I believed the enemy's lies." Model was desperately attempting to construct a psychological wall of pure dread behind his troops, hoping that the absolute certainty of the hangman's noose in the rear would somehow outweigh the terrifying reality of the American artillery to their front. Against this internal campaign of terror, the American forces launched an unprecedented, devastatingly sophisticated psychological offensive. They understood that to shatter the Ruhr pocket without a bloody urban battle, they had to bypass Model's execution squads and speak directly to the starving, exhausted men freezing in the trenches. The Allied psychological warfare branch swung into full operation, deploying a weapon far more dangerous than high explosives: cold, undeniable truth. Their primary delivery system was paper, delivered through specifically modified artillery munitions. American batteries fired 105mm smoke shells that had been emptied of their chemical payload and tightly packed with hundreds of leaflets. These shells were fused to burst high in the air, scattering clouds of paper that drifted down over the German positions like snow. The American psychological approach in the spring of 1945 had evolved far beyond the crude, boastful propaganda of the early war years. It was brilliantly clinical. The leaflets did not insult Hitler, nor did they demand ideological surrender. Instead, they presented brutal, mathematical facts. The airborne literature featured highly detailed, perfectly accurate topographical maps of the encirclement. These maps showed the trapped soldiers exactly where they were, while simultaneously highlighting how far the main American thrusts had already advanced past them, driving deep into the heart of the Reich. They listed the precise, overwhelming logistical statistics of the encircling Allied armies, detailing the sheer tonnage of fuel and ammunition massed against them. Most famously, they blanketed the ruins with the Safe Conduct Pass, printed with official-looking government seals, intricately designed to resemble a formal legal document or a banknote. It was written in both English and German. The text was simple and legally binding. It explicitly instructed any American frontline soldier to treat the bearer with strict adherence to the Geneva Convention, guaranteeing immediate removal from the combat zone, access to medical care, and, most crucially, hot rations. To a German soldier, conditioned by years of merciless, lawless slaughter on the Eastern Front, this bureaucratic, civilized promise of survival was profoundly disarming. The Americans compounded this airborne paper bombardment with highly targeted, tactical sound. Under the cover of darkness, specialized combat broadcasting teams crept into the shattered, crater-pocked no-man's land between the lines. They drove M8 armored cars and heavily modified jeeps equipped with massive, high-powered public address speakers mounted on their roofs. In the dead of night, the eerie, tense silence of the ruined industrial zones would be suddenly broken by the sound of nostalgic, pre-war German music floating through the fog. Then, a calm, authoritative, German-speaking voice would echo through the rubble. The broadcasters were not American actors. They were often German exiles, refugees, or meticulously trained intelligence officers who understood the exact cultural nuances of the men they were targeting. They did not shout or threaten. They simply stated the reality of the situation with devastating precision. Leveraging intercepts from frontline radio traffic, they would broadcast highly specific, localized intelligence directly to individual units. A voice echoing in the dark would say, "Attention men of the 116th Panzer Division. We know your battalion commander was killed yesterday. We know you have not received rations in 4 days. You are completely surrounded by 3 American armored divisions. There is no relief force. Walk across the line tomorrow at dawn. Leave your weapons. We have hot coffee and white bread waiting." The psychological devastation of realizing that the enemy knew your tactical situation far better than your own generals was incalculable. For the German frontline soldier, shivering in a muddy crater or huddled in the flooded basement of a ruined steel mill, the battle became a profound, agonizing test of reality. On one side stood the fanatical orders of Field Marshal Model, demanding suicidal resistance in the name of a promised final victory, enforced by the very real threat of the military police firing squad. On the other side was the calm, methodical voice of the American broadcaster, the official-looking Safe Conduct Pass burning a hole in their tunic pocket, and the promise of life. But what ultimately broke the will of Army Group B was not just the leaflets or the loudspeakers. It was the visual, physical confirmation of everything the Americans claimed. The German soldiers' own senses betrayed Model's lies every single minute of the day. Whenever the heavy April clouds broke, the sky was utterly dominated by the Allies. Thousands of heavy bombers droned overhead in pristine, undisturbed formations, casting massive shadows over the pocket as they flew eastward to systematically pulverize the rest of the Reich. Lower down, swarms of American Thunderbolts and British Typhoons roamed the airspace freely, strafing any vehicle that dared to move on the roads. The once mighty Air Force that had promised to protect the skies of Germany was entirely, completely absent. The contrast on the ground was even more demoralizing. The sensory experience of the trapped defender was one of total impotence. If a German artillery battery somehow managed to scrape together enough hoarded shells to fire a single, desperate volley, the American response was instantaneous, overwhelming, and terrifying. Within minutes, highly coordinated barrages would rain hundreds of counter-battery shells down on the German position, obliterating it entirely. The Americans possessed so much ammunition, they used heavy artillery simply to harass individual snipers or clear minor roadblocks. But perhaps the most profound psychological blow came from simply observing the American logistical machinery at work. Through their binoculars, starving German sentries watched American supply convoys rolling bumper to bumper along the captured highways just beyond the perimeter. At night, in blatant, arrogant defiance of wartime blackout regulations, the Americans drove their trucks with their headlights completely illuminated. This was a luxury utterly unthinkable to the Germans, and it communicated a terrifying, unspoken message. The Americans possessed infinite resources, infinite fuel, absolute air supremacy, and they were so completely unopposed that they did not even fear the night. The collision of this absolute physical deprivation and the undeniable, mathematically certain reality of defeat finally caused the structural integrity of the defending army to violently shatter. The collapse did not happen everywhere simultaneously. It began as a slow, insidious leak of discipline that rapidly escalated into an uncontrollable flood. Fanaticism is a highly fragile psychological state. It requires momentum, an illusion of progress, or at least the prospect that a soldier's death will achieve some tangible tactical goal. But holding a ruined, flooded factory floor in a surrounded pocket, without food, without ammunition, while the enemy ignores you to advance hundreds of miles past your position, strips the glory from the sacrifice. The soldiers realized they were not defending their homeland. They were simply waiting to be pulverized in a trap that had already been rendered strategically irrelevant. The carefully constructed wall of internal terror finally cracked. The feared military police lost their power the moment entire platoons decided they were no longer willing to die. You cannot hang a man when 100 of his heavily armed comrades turn their rifles on the executioner. The surrenders began quietly, under the cover of darkness. A lone sentry would slip out of his trench, leave his rifle in the mud, pull an American safe conduct pass from his pocket, and walk out into the fog with his hands raised. By morning, his entire squad would realize he was gone, and the next night, they would follow his path. Soon, the necessity of darkness vanished entirely. The hierarchical structure of the military dissolved from the bottom up. Junior officers stopped issuing combat orders and began organizing their men for surrender. Whole companies, and then entire battalions, began marching down the ruined roads in broad daylight toward the American checkpoints. They discarded their steel helmets, threw their weapons into the ditches, tore off their insignia, and walked with a collective sense of exhausted, profound relief. The American infantrymen, who had spent weeks mentally preparing for a bitter, house-to-house bloodbath in the urban jungle, found themselves completely overwhelmed by a radically different problem. They were not fighting an army. They were attempting to process a massive, spontaneous migration of defeated men. Forward combat battalions were frequently forced to halt their advance, not because of enemy fire, but simply because they could not physically manage the sheer volume of prisoners flooding through their lines. Tens of thousands of veteran soldiers were giving up without firing a single shot. The psychological pressure had successfully broken the soldiers on the front line, but an unexpected and devastating threat to the German command was about to emerge from within their own cities. The collapse of Army Group B was not confined to the muddy trenches and cratered perimeters. Deep inside the pocket, an entirely different kind of rebellion was brewing. The Ruhrgebiet was not an empty battlefield. It was a densely populated urban sprawl, home to over 3 million German civilians. These people were trapped in the same tightening cage as the army, enduring the same starvation, and living in the flooded cellars of their pulverized cities. For years, the propaganda apparatus had promised them that the Wehrmacht was their impenetrable shield. Now, that shield had become a fatal liability. As American artillery batteries moved into range of the innermost cities, the grim reality of urban combat loomed. If German commanders followed Field Marshal Modell's orders to fight block by block, the Americans would not hesitate to systematically level what little remained of the region's infrastructure. Furthermore, Hitler's Nero decree demanded that the defending German forces actively destroy the surviving waterworks, power stations, and coal mines to deny them to the enemy. For the local mayors, civil servants, and ordinary citizens, this was a death sentence. A fierce, desperate friction erupted between the civilian administration and the military command. Civic leaders who had been strictly compliant just weeks prior began actively sabotaging the defense. Local mayors repeatedly pleaded with Wehrmacht officers to declare their towns open cities, begging them to spare the surviving civilian population from the impending American bombardment. When German combat engineers arrived to wire bridges or municipal power grids for demolition, they were frequently met by angry mobs of civilians, often women, factory workers, and elderly men, who physically blocked the explosives from being set. White bed sheets began appearing from the windows of civilian apartment blocks, a blatant and highly illegal signal of surrender, hung right above the heads of German troops attempting to dig fighting positions in the streets. For the frontline soldier, already exhausted and demoralized by the endless American leaflets and broadcasts, this civilian defiance delivered the final, fatal psychological blow. The entire ideological foundation of their war was built on the concept of defending the fatherland. But standing in the rubble of Essen or Dortmund, the German infantryman was forced into a horrifying realization. The people of the fatherland no longer wanted his protection. They looked at the field gray uniform, not with gratitude, but with outright terror and resentment. The soldiers realized that their continued resistance was not saving their country. It was only guaranteeing the slaughter of their own families and neighbors. To be isolated by the enemy was a terrifying tactical problem. To be isolated and rejected by your own people was a spiritual death blow. Stripped of mobility, starved of ammunition, and now fundamentally alienated from the very civilians they were supposed to be fighting for, the last remnants of unit cohesion evaporated. The unified German defense fractured into utter chaos. By mid-April, the American 1st and Ninth Armies drove the final steel wedges into this chaos. Seizing upon the rapid disintegration of German morale, Allied armored columns abandoned cautious probing and simply accelerated down the main highways, cutting directly across the industrial basin. On April 14th, the American pincers met near the city of Hagen, effectively slicing the already shrinking pocket cleanly in half. This physical bisection was the death blow to any remaining illusion of command and control. The centralized communication network of Army Group B was obliterated. Division commanders could no longer reach their corps headquarters. Battalion commanders lost contact with their front lines. The German military apparatus did not just bend under the pressure, it completely and fundamentally shattered. What followed was an event that American field commanders had never fully anticipated. The quiet trickle of nighttime surrenders suddenly erupted into a daytime tidal wave. Entire regiments, recognizing that their command structure had ceased to exist and their defensive orders were functionally meaningless, marched toward the American lines in perfectly disciplined formations, seeking to be captured. The sheer volume of capitulation created a bizarre tactical crisis for the advancing Allies. Forward combat units, primed for a bitter house-to-house bloodbath, found themselves physically blocked by endless columns of field gray uniforms jamming the cratered roads. American logistics officers, who had stockpiled millions of rounds of ammunition for a prolonged siege, were suddenly scrambling to requisition enough barbed wire and open farmland to build massive, temporary enclosures. They were no longer fighting a hostile army. They were managing the spontaneous surrender of hundreds of thousands of men. Deep within this collapsing epicenter, Field Marshal Walter Model faced the absolute ruin of his military career. The man hailed as the Führer's fireman, who had repeatedly salvaged impossible situations on the Eastern Front through sheer force of will and draconian discipline, was now entirely out of options. Berlin was still transmitting frantic, deeply delusional radio directives, demanding that Model launch a massive breakout offensive, execute anyone caught retreating, and hold the ruined factories to the last bullet. But Model could not command an army that was already turning itself in. The psychological pressure of the encirclement had finally broken the commander himself. He was trapped in an impossible paradox. His fierce ideological loyalty to Hitler demanded that he fight to the death, but his pragmatic understanding of the tactical reality confirmed that further resistance was nothing more than pointless murder. On April 15th, Model made a decision that directly defied the foundational dogma of the Third Reich. He did not order a suicidal final stand in the rubble. Instead, he issued an unprecedented directive dissolving Army Group B. He officially discharged the youngest and oldest soldiers, telling them to discard their uniforms, secure civilian paperwork, and walk home. He granted the remaining combat veterans permission to formally surrender to the Americans. In a final, legally staggering move, he officially released his men from their sacred oath of loyalty to Adolf Hitler. Yet, the field marshal could not extend that same absolution to himself. Haunted by his own complicity in the war's prolongation and fearing indictment as a war criminal by the Soviets, he refused to endure the humiliation of a formal surrender. A field marshal does not become a prisoner, he allegedly told his remaining staff officers. On April 21st, as American infantry cleared the final isolated pockets of resistance, Model walked into a dense oak forest south of Duisburg. There, beneath the spring canopy, he drew his service pistol and ended his own life. The apocalyptic urban bloodbath that Allied planners had dreaded never materialized. The anticipated Western Stalingrad was quietly replaced by the shuffling, defeated march of over 250,000 prisoners walking into the fog. When the final, temporary barbed wire enclosures were tallied, the sheer scale of the capitulation eclipsed even the staggering initial estimates. Over 317,000 German soldiers, including 30 generals, had surrendered to the American First and Ninth Armies. The formidable Army Group B, the heavily armed veteran force that had inflicted devastating casualties on the Allies during the Battle of the Bulge just months prior, had simply ceased to exist. By systematically dismantling this massive formation, the Allies neutralized the last significant military obstacle in the West. And crucially, they achieved this without triggering the block-by-block urban bloodbath that had haunted the pre-operation planning tables. The rapid collapse of the Ruhr Pocket stands as a profound masterclass in the anatomy of modern industrial warfare. It proved that effectively defeating a deeply entrenched enemy in a complex urban environment requires far more than simply drawing a ring of armor around a city on a map. A physical siege alone merely traps an army. It does not inevitably break it. The American triumph in the spring of 1945 was rooted in a highly calculated, dual-layered strangulation. First, they methodically destroyed the enemy's physical capacity to wage war. By targeting the unglamorous but fundamental arteries of industry, the dams, the reservoirs, and the rail junctions, they turned the technologically superior German tanks into useless steel monuments and silenced the heavy artillery. They rendered the defensive advantages of the concrete terrain irrelevant by stripping the defenders of the fuel and water required to actually utilize it. But the second, and ultimately more devastating layer, was the psychological encirclement. The Allied command understood that military fanaticism requires a narrative of purpose. To fracture the German lines, the Americans had to systematically destroy the defenders' perception of a survivable future. Every detailed map dropped from an artillery shell, every localized loudspeaker broadcast echoing in the dark, every unopposed bomber formation passing overhead, and every American supply truck driving defiantly with its headlights illuminated served a singular purpose. They were instruments of undeniable, overwhelming reality. They mathematically proved to the individual German soldier, shivering in a flooded cellar, that dying for a ruined factory would achieve absolutely no tactical or strategic goal. The Allies successfully dismantled the ideological wall of terror built by the German High Command, proving that the true center of gravity in a siege is the mind of the trapped soldier. The staggering collapse of Fortress Ruhr proved, on an unprecedented scale, that a modern mechanized army is rarely destroyed by bullets, artillery shells, or brutal frontal assaults alone. A formidable military machine does not actually perish in the exact moment it fires its final round, nor does it wait for the last man to fall. Rather, it dies the very second the inescapable mathematics of survival can no longer be ignored. When physical isolation becomes absolute, when the logistical lifeblood evaporates, and when the ideological illusion of a greater purpose is permanently stripped away by the enemy, even the most fanatical force will eventually lay down its weapons and surrender to the cold, undeniable geometry of defeat.